May 11th, 1999, Barry County, Missouri. 34-year-old Gary McCullough vanishes from his farm, and his abandoned pickup truck is found on a rural road 5 days later. Suspicion is directed towards Gary's wife Sandy, who is having an affair with another man, and they immediately move in together before they get married. In 2006, Sandy's 20-year-old daughter Lena Chapin disappears and is not officially reported missing for years. Investigators come to believe that Sandy killed Gary and later got rid of Lena because she assisted with the cover-up, but no trace of the two missing victims is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we'll be covering a pair of missing persons cases which took place nearly 7 years apart, but are connected to the same family. The 1999 disappearance of Gary McCullough and the 2006 disappearance of Lena Chapin. As I'm sure many of you know, this story was featured on one of the episodes on the Unsolved Mysteries reboot which launched on Netflix 3 years ago, and as you can imagine, I've received numerous requests to cover it. Before he went missing, Gary McCullough had been Lena Chapin's stepfather, and his wife Sandy was having an affair with another man named Kristopher Klemp. While the authorities immediately suspected that Sandy and Chris were responsible for Gary's disappearance, they felt powerless to do anything about it without a body or strong physical evidence of foul play. The case would go in an even more disturbing direction in 2006 when Lena disappeared, but she was not officially reported missing for years, since Sandy just told everyone that her daughter had decided to run away with another man, even though she left a young son behind. While Lena was only 13 years old at the time Gary vanished, she had once made a tape-recorded confession that her mother killed Gary and then forced her to help dispose of Gary's body and cover up the crime. So it's been theorized that Sandy eventually decided that Lena was too much of a liability and made her disappear as well. It's a truly heartbreaking situation which has devastated two families, but once again, without Lena's body or any physical evidence, investigators have been reluctant to file charges. The one thing we do know for certain is that after 2 decades, Gary and Lena are both still missing persons, so in this episode, we're going to attempt to perform an in-depth analysis of this convoluted case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearances of Gary McCullough and Lena Chapin. Our story begins in 1999 in Barry County, Missouri. Our first victim is 34-year-old Gary McCullough, who works as a supervisor at a chicken processing plant and lives on a farm just outside the town of Cassville alongside his 32-year-old wife Sandra McCullough, who goes by the name Sandy. Gary and Sandy have been married for just over 2 years at this point, and she has a total of 6 daughters: Lena, Brandy, Robin, Jeannie, Rachel, and Rosie. Gary also has 2 daughters of his own from a previous marriage named Joy and April, and has been divorced twice. Throughout their childhood, Sandy and her daughters frequently lived in poverty and moved around a lot, while she became involved in relationships with a number of different men. She has 2 prior divorces under her belt, but from what I can tell, Lena is the only biological child of her first husband, Robert Chapin. I'll go into more detail about this later on, but apparently, all of these girls were conceived by different men, and many of them do not even know who their biological father is. What further complicates this situation is that Sandy's second husband was Gary's brother, Albert McCullough. Sandy and Albert married in November of 1994 and lived in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and since Sandy was often busy going to school to prepare for a nursing career, there were times when Albert practically had to raise Sandy's daughters. Albert eventually learned that Sandy was having an affair with Gary, which caused the brothers to get into a fistfight in May of 1996. At one point, Albert had Gary pinned down until Sandy hit him from behind with a large stick and told him that their marriage was over. Even though Albert warned his brother that Sandy was trouble, Gary, Sandy, and her daughter still moved on to a farm in Barry County, and the couple got married in December of that year. While the girls considered Gary to be a strict stepfather who made them do a lot of chores around the farm, they also believed that he was a very caring and loving person and appreciated the stability he provided for them. On May the 13th, 1999, the Barry County Sheriff's Office received a call from Gary's cousin, who was concerned because no one from his family had heard from him for days. At around 2:30 p.m. on May the 11th, Gary had left the chicken processing plant after his shift ended and went to visit a relative before he presumably headed home. But over the course of the next 2 days, Gary did not show up for his scheduled shifts at the plant or call them to let them know he wouldn't be there, which was very uncharacteristic of him, particularly since he could not afford to miss work. Around the same time they spoke to Gary's cousin, the sheriff's office received a report about loose cattle wandering around his farm, so they decided to send 2 deputies out there. When they arrived, they spoke to Sandy, who confirmed that she had not seen Gary since May the 11th. According to Sandy, Gary left the farm in his 1979 Ford flatbed pickup truck and was planning to travel over 40 miles to the town of Diamond, where he was going to buy a fighting rooster from a Mexican person. Sandy said that Gary never returned, and now that 2 days had passed, she told the deputies, quote, "Well, I guess while you're here, I should go ahead and report Gary missing." However, right from the outset, there appeared to be a hole in Sandy's story. When Gary failed to show up at the plant on the morning of May the 12th, his supervisor called the farm and spoke to one of Sandy's daughters, who said that Gary had already left for work that morning, even though Sandy claimed he never returned home the previous day. Well, on May the 16th, Gary's pickup truck was found abandoned on Farm Road 2050, a dead-end road located in the unincorporated community of Pulaski Field, about 20 miles from Gary's farm. While there were no obvious signs of violence or struggle in the truck, investigators feared that Gary may have become the victim of foul play, particularly after they started hearing stories about the state of his marriage to Sandy. According to Gary's attorney, Richard Anderson, Gary had told him that Sandy was having an affair and he was looking to seek a divorce from her. About a month and a half before he disappeared, Gary had been arrested for passing a series of bad checks at a number of stores in Carroll County, Arkansas, and soon learned that Sandy had passed the checks after forging his signature. Sandy had also attempted to sell off some of Gary's calves at a livestock sale under his name without his permission, and he became so distrustful of her that he instructed his supervisors at the chicken processing plant not to give Sandy any of his paychecks even if she asked for them. While preparing for his divorce, Gary had secretly been moving some of his belongings into the home of one of his friends, Jeff Allen, who had his own disturbing story to share. According to Jeff, on April the 30th, 2 weeks before he vanished, Gary had brought a shotgun over to his house and asked Jeff to hide it because he feared Sandy was going to use it to kill him. Gary told Jeff that Sandy had stuck the shotgun into his belly and pulled the trigger while the gun was empty, but when Jeff looked inside the barrel, he found a shell in there. Since Gary always kept his gun unloaded, it now seemed apparent that Sandy had attempted to kill him, and the only reason Jeff survived was because the shell was a dud and did not fire. In spite of this, Gary elected not to notify the police about the incident. The last time Gary saw his mother, Ella McCullough, was on May the 9th, when he visited her at her farm and told her that he feared for his life. Even though Ella advised Gary not to return home, he did so anyway because he feared that Sandy might harm his cows and his dogs. The Barry County Sheriff's Office obtained a search warrant for Gary's house, and Sandy reluctantly granted them permission to look inside. While they did not find any incriminating evidence, they were surprised to see that Gary's clothing and personal possessions were no longer in the house, and it almost seemed like he had never lived there. However, one odd item they did find was a checkbook which belonged to 22-year-old Kristopher Klemp, who hailed from a local family that had a lot of money and property. Even though Chris was married to another woman named Jennifer Bratton Klemp, investigators were soon surprised to learn that only 2 days after performing their search of Gary's house, Chris permanently moved in there with Sandy. It now seemed apparent that they were conducting an affair, and when questioned, Chris eventually admitted to the affair and said that it originally began 2 months before Gary went missing. Jeff Allen would confirm that when Gary became suspicious of Sandy, he attached a dog's tracking collar to his truck before Sandy borrowed it, and used the tracking collar to follow her to a rendezvous with Chris. This led to a confrontation between the two men, in which Gary told Chris he would not hurt him, but he would take action if he saw Chris with Sandy again. Sandy was very uncooperative with investigators, and when asked if she would be willing to take a polygraph, Sandy replied, quote, "If you find a body, I'll take a polygraph." While the sheriff's office attempted to interview Sandy's daughters, they would not cooperate either. Lena, who was 13 years old at this point, came across as particularly hostile and defensive about the whole situation, and her sister Robin would later say that Lena discouraged her siblings from speaking to the authorities. Well, on June the 7th, the sheriff's office charged Chris with conspiracy to commit murder, as one witness claimed they had heard him speak about being involved with a married woman and say that he knew how to dispose of her husband's body so that no one would ever find it. Another key witness was a man named Stephen Turner, who alleged that Chris had offered him money to kill Gary, but Turner wanted nothing to do with it. Incriminating evidence was also provided by Chris's estranged wife, Jennifer. It turned out that Sandy had told Chris that she was pregnant with his child and that Gary was beating her, but while neither of these statements were true, Chris bought her a promise ring from a local jewelry store. 3 days before Gary went missing, Sandy phoned Jennifer and told her about the promise ring and that she was pregnant with Chris's child, so she advised her to stay away from Chris. When Jennifer confronted Chris about this, he allegedly said that, quote-unquote, he had no time to deal with her because he had to deal with killing a man. Jennifer said she also once heard Gary speaking to Sandy over the phone and stating, quote, "Everything will be all right, just trust me, I'll be the one going to jail." Following his arrest, Chris was released on bond, but by August, the conspiracy to commit murder charge would be dropped due to lack of evidence. The Barry County prosecutor Stephen Hemphill stated, quote, "Proceeding at this point will force me to reveal evidence that might compromise an ongoing murder investigation," end quote. Chris soon took Sandy and her daughters and moved over 200 miles away to St. Louis. By April of 2000, Gary had still not resurfaced, so Sandy managed to obtain a divorce from him in absentia, as Gary did not show up for the scheduled divorce hearing. 1 month later, Sandy and Chris were officially married, and she started going by his surname. In August of that year, the entire Klemp family relocated to the unincorporated community of Sligo and lived on property on Dent County Road 4010, which belonged to Chris's parents. The investigation into Gary's disappearance would remain at a standstill for the next 3 years, but on June 26, 2003, Lena Chapin came forward with a shocking story. Like I mentioned earlier, Lena had been 13 years old at the time Gary went missing, and was now 2 months shy of the age of 18. Even though Lena was the second oldest of Sandy's daughters, she was known as the one who took charge and told her sisters what to do. Even though she could be hot-tempered, she generally got along with her siblings, who described her as the quote-unquote glue that held us together. However, they noticed that Lena's ordinarily bubbly personality seemed to change after Gary vanished, as she dropped out of high school, had a few minor scrapes with the law, and often spent time partying, drinking, and doing drugs with the wrong crowd. While drinking beer with another teenage boy, Lena had apparently gotten intoxicated and shared a surprising story, so this boy encouraged her to tell an adult about it. So Lena decided to speak with Gary's brother Albert, as they had always gotten along well when he was her stepfather. Lena revealed that on May the 11th, 1999, she and her sisters had returned home from school, and Sandy told them that a cat had given birth to some kittens in the field. She then ordered the other girls to go searching for the kittens before taking Lena into the house. Sandy then led her into one of the bedrooms and showed her Gary's dead body on the floor. According to Lena, her mother had shot Gary 3 times in the head while he was sitting on the couch eating scrambled eggs, and Sandy would force her to help dispose of the body, clean up the murder scene, and cover up the crime. Lena said she went along with it because she feared that if her mother was arrested and sent to prison, she and her siblings would all be split up and placed into separate foster homes. Gary's body would be chopped up into pieces and wrapped in plastic before it was burned in a brush pile on the property, and Lena said she was forced to dig through the ashes in order to search for Gary's remaining bone fragments. The charred bones were then placed into some buckets, and Sandy then drove down a country road while dumping the remains out the window in order to scatter them everywhere. Well, when Lena shared this story with Albert, she was unaware that he was secretly recording her, and he proceeded to take the tape to the Barry County Sheriff's Office. They soon attempted to contact Lena, but Sandy hired a lawyer for her. Lena exercised her right to remain silent and elected not to speak with investigators, though she never actually went so far as to recant her story. Regardless, without Lena's cooperation, her tape-recorded statement was considered to be nothing more than hearsay, so the investigation into Gary's disappearance once again hit a brick wall. Gary's father, Wayne McCullough, was left so devastated by the loss of his son and the lack of progress with finding him that he once made a scene at the Barry County Sheriff's Office, which led to him being banned from the facility, and he might have been put in jail had he not been dragged out by a relative. The stress of the situation eventually caused Wayne to succumb to a fatal heart attack. In November of 2003, nearly 5 months after making her incriminating statement, Lena gave birth to a baby boy named Coulter. In spite of her previous wild ways, Lena attempted to be the best mother she could for her son, as she worked several jobs to provide for Coulter, with Sandy helping to look after him. In March of 2005, Gary was declared legally dead by his family, but over the course of the next year, his attorney, Gary Anderson, would convince Gary's 2 daughters, Joy and April, to file a civil lawsuit. The suit was officially filed on June 26, 2006, with Sandy, Chris, Lena, and Chris's ex-wife, Jennifer Bratton, all being named as defendants who were responsible for Gary's death. Anderson was hoping that Lena, who was 20 years old by this point, would agree to a deal in which she would receive immunity for testifying against Sandy and Chris, but while court summons were delivered to the other defendants, Lena could not be located, and it turned out that she had not been seen in over 4 months. When asked about her daughter's whereabouts, Sandy told investigators that sometime in mid-February, Lena had taken off to Florida with another man and left behind her son, car, and all of her personal belongings. 1 month after Lena left, Sandy and Chris took their family and relocated to an 80-acre ranch just north of the town of Salem, and Sandy apparently told her other daughters that Lena had said bad things about them before she took off and wanted nothing more to do with them. Sandy would eventually file child abandonment charges against her daughter, and since Lena never appeared in court to defend herself, Sandy received legal custody of Coulter. In September of that year, Sandy contacted the Dent County Sheriff's Office to inform them that she had been assaulted inside her home by a masked intruder dressed in camouflage. She expressed her belief that the attacker was Gary, who was still alive and hiding somewhere. Well, even though Sandy did have bruises on her face, the sheriff's office could not find any footprints on her property to suggest that an intruder had been there, and there was no other evidence to support her story. Well, even though Lena could not be found, a missing persons report was never actually filed for her, and Sandy reportedly started spreading rumors that Lena was a drug addict who had become involved in prostitution. The person who took the initiative to officially report Lena missing was her biological father, Robert Chapin, but this would not take place for nearly 3 years. After not hearing from his daughter for that long, Robert decided to contact the Barry County Sheriff's Office, and on November 17, 2008, Lena was officially entered as a missing person into the National Crime Information Center database but another 3.5 years would pass before a proper investigation was launched. In March of 2012, the Dent County Sheriff's Office decided to take a fresh look at Lena's case and learned that prior to her disappearance, she had become engaged to a young man named Jason Bryant, and both she and Coulter had moved into an apartment with Jason in the town of Steelville. When Jason was interviewed, he claimed that he last saw Lena at their apartment on the morning of February the 14th, 2006, when he left to go to work. But when Jason returned later that evening, he was surprised to find Sandy and 2 other people there who were in the midst of clearing out Lena's belongings. Sandy then shared the same story about Lena having run off to Florida with another man, and informed Jason that she was now going to be taking care of Coulter. While Jason found the story to be odd, he apparently took Sandy at her word and moved out of the apartment 1 month later. Investigators would also learn that when Lena's belongings were removed from her apartment, Sandy just left them on the back porch of her house for a long period of time until they were ruined by the weather. It turned out that there had been no activity on Lena's social security number since 2006 and no evidence to suggest she was still alive, so a few months after this new investigation was launched, this entire story finally started getting coverage in the local media. Much like when Gary went missing, Sandy would not cooperate with the authorities, and when missing persons flyers were posted for Lena throughout Salem, Sandy reportedly paid one of her daughters to take the flyers down. Well, in July of 2013, after many years of delays, the civil trial for the wrongful death lawsuit that Gary's daughters had filed finally began in Stone County Circuit Court. I mentioned earlier that Chris's ex-wife, Jennifer Bratton, had originally been named as a defendant in the lawsuit, as on the day Gary disappeared, she had allegedly dropped Chris off at Gary's farm. Jennifer later returned to pick up Chris at around 3:30 a.m. on May the 12th, and he was reportedly carrying a gun and looked very scared. But before the trial began, a decision was made to drop Jennifer from the lawsuit. Since it was considered to be hearsay, the tape-recorded statement that Lena had made about Gary's murder could not be presented as evidence at the trial and was never heard by the jury. But by this point, 2 of Sandy's daughters, Brandy Peterson and Robin Shoemake, were completely estranged from her and would provide some shocking testimony. Brandy and Robin both corroborated Lena's story that on the day Gary went missing, they had returned home from school and Sandy met them to say that a cat had given birth to some kittens in the field and they needed to go look for them. Lena was then led into the house while Brandy went to milk the cows, but since she needed some supplies, Brandy returned to the house and noticed Sandy on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor with what appeared to be bleach. Later that night, Gary had still not returned home, so Sandy gathered the girls around the dinner table and told them that if anyone asked about Gary, they were to say that he went to buy a fighting rooster and they hadn't seen him since, and they needed to stick by this story. However, even though Gary had supposedly left the farm earlier that day, Brandy and Robin recalled seeing his truck parked in the woods on the property after they arrived home, and it did not wind up being abandoned on Farm Road 2050 until a later time. After their conversation at the dinner table, all of the girls went into their bedrooms, but Robin said she overheard Sandy telling Lena to make sure none of her sisters came outside. Sometime later, Robin said she peeked outside the bedroom window and saw Sandy and Chris struggling to carry something which was wrapped in a tarp. Since there appeared to be boots sticking out of the tarp, Robin believed that it contained Gary's body. She found the experience to be so terrifying that she stayed silent for years, and recalled Lena telling her not to say anything or else all the children would be taken away and separated. Brandy testified that shortly after she made her recorded confession to Albert, Lena opened up to her as well and shared the same story about helping to cover up Gary's murder. A few days later, Brandy confronted her mother about this and accused her of killing Gary, but Lena overheard her from the other room and responded by slamming Brandy into a mirror, causing her to cut her finger on a broken shard of glass. Sandy and Chris then placed Brandy in their truck and said they were going to take her to the hospital, but they instead drove her out into a remote area. Chris then pointed a shotgun at Brandy's head and threatened to shoot her, so Brandy responded by jumping into her mother's lap. She begged Chris not to hurt her, so Sandy finally told him to put the gun down, and they all drove back to the house. Sandy told Brandy that Chris was just trying to scare her, and after Sandy forced him to apologize, they shared a group hug. But Brandy was left so shaken by the incident that she immediately moved out of her mother's house and kept her mouth shut for years. Brandy and Robin also revealed that after giving birth to 6 girls, Sandy had always been desperate to have a boy, so when Lena gave birth to Coulter, Sandy became very possessive of him and started pushing him to call her mom. The relationship between Sandy and Lena grew quite tense because Lena was becoming more independent from her mother, and Sandy felt threatened by this. There was one incident where Lena was planning to take Coulter to see his father in Arkansas, but Sandy phoned her up and demanded that she bring Coulter home immediately or she would kill herself. Prior to Lena's disappearance, Sandy said that she had wanted legal guardianship over Coulter, but Lena told her it would only happen, quote-unquote, over my dead body. After she got married to Jason Bryant, Lena was planning to take Coulter and permanently move to Arkansas, but she went missing before this could happen, and Brandy and Robin did not believe she would have taken off to Florida and willingly abandoned her son. Sandy and Chris never bothered to attend the civil trial, and when the case went to the jury, they deliberated for less than 1 hour before they reached a unanimous verdict in which they found the couple liable for Gary's death and awarded $7 million in damages to his daughters. As far as I can tell, Sandy and Chris have never paid out any of that money, and in November of 2014, just over 1 year after the verdict, the couple got divorced. Sandy would eventually get married for the 5th time and move to Mount Vernon, Missouri, where she lives under her new married name, Sandy Wink. She continued to retain custody of Coulter and proceeded to homeschool the boy and keep him sheltered for years, as she apparently felt that sending him to school would cause him to hear rumors about her potential involvement in Lena's disappearance. This story would receive national exposure when it was featured on an episode of the Unsolved Mysteries reboot on Netflix titled Missing Witness, which dropped on July 1st, 2010. While Sandy and Chris declined to be interviewed on the episode, Brandy and Robin both appeared on camera to publicly share their belief that their mother was responsible for 2 murders. The episode also showed the 2 sisters being given permission to search the 2 properties that Sandy and Chris had lived on in both Sligo and Salem during the time period Lena went missing. Brandy recalled there being a well on the property in Sligo which had stones lining up the sides, but when she visited the location during the episode, the well was no longer there, and she suspected that Sandy may have filled it in before she moved. Robin also recalled that when Sandy and Chris moved their family to the ranch in Salem, she overheard Sandy pointing out 4 trees in front of the house where she said her dog was buried. Robin found this statement to be odd, since Sandy had previously said that she buried the dog on a hill on the property in Sligo. Investigators brought a ground-penetrating radar device to the ranch to search the area next to these trees, but nothing was found. While the release of the Unsolved Mysteries episode brought in several new tips, it failed to bring the case any closer to a resolution. For the past 5 generations, members of the McCullough family have been laid to rest at a special graveyard on their property called McCullough Cemetery, but they are fearful that Gary's remains may never be recovered in order for him to receive a proper burial there. Even though Sandy is still suspected of being responsible for Gary and Lena's disappearances, and both victims are presumed to be deceased, the authorities still lack the evidence to file any charges. So for the moment, Gary McCullough and Lena Chapin both continue to remain missing persons. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I have to mention that while the majority of people out there first became familiar with this case from Unsolved Mysteries, I actually first learned about it 10 years ago when I featured it in an article I wrote for listfirst.com titled 10 People Who Weren't Reported Missing for Years. As you recall, even though Lena Chapin disappeared in February of 2006, an official missing persons report was not actually filed for her until November of 2008, and an investigation was not launched until March of 2012. A few months later, the local media started reporting on her case, but even though Gary McCullough's disappearance had gotten prior media coverage in the past, I don't believe the general public had any idea that Lena was missing for 6 years. Of course, when I first learned about this story, I found it pretty unbelievable that this young woman may have been killed by her own mother because she had knowledge and possible involvement in the murder of her former stepfather, so I wondered why the story didn't seem to have much coverage outside the Missouri area. Of course, whenever I wrote about a case in my list first articles, my summaries would generally only be about 300 words long, so there was no way my original article could do justice to such a convoluted story, and I was quite happy to see it receive mainstream attention on Netflix. I'll state right up front that as wild as this whole situation may be, there doesn't seem to be much of a mystery about what actually happened, and if I made a list of cases featured on The Trail Went Cold, which I'm shocked have never been solved, this would rank right near the top. This really seems like an example of someone who has managed to get away with murder not once, but twice, because they just happened to do a very thorough job of disposing of the victims' bodies. I have been critical of the Unsolved Mysteries reboot for featuring some cases in which they've twisted the facts to make a victim's suicide or accidental death look like a homicide, meaning that there is no actual crime to solve. But here, we have a cut-and-dried story of 2 missing victims who were clearly the victims of foul play, so giving it exposure on a platform like Netflix only increases the chances of the right person coming forward with information and paving the way for a potential resolution. Granted, it's now been 3 years since the Missing Witness episode originally dropped, and both these cases are still unsolved, but there may be people out there who hold the key to the mystery. So on the basis of what we know about this story, Sandy Peterson /McCullough /Klemp /Wink, or whatever surname she's using now, appears to be an evil monster who not only murdered her husband, but enlisted her teenage daughter to help her cover up the crime, and then proceeded to murder her as well several years later. But surprisingly, the Unsolved Mysteries episode begins with Sandy's daughter Brandy describing her as a very loving mother who worked hard, never did drugs or alcohol, and ensured that her children were never without food, even though they grew up in poverty. Sandy also frequently told her daughters how much she loved them, which is why Brandy said that this is how she would prefer to remember her mother. When you hear about this side of Sandy, you get the sense that she was a very manipulative and narcissistic person, and have a better understanding of why many of her children decided to stand by her for years, even after she was accused of doing terrible things. Since they testified against Sandy at her civil trial and agreed to be interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, we know that Brandy and Robin are now completely estranged from her and have zero doubt that their mother was responsible for killing Gary and Lena. As far as I can tell, their other sisters, Jeannie, Rachel, and Rosie, have rarely spoken publicly about the situation, so I have no idea what kind of relationship they have with Sandy today, or if they also believe she's a murderer. But some of these girls were quite young when Gary and Lena went missing, and may not even have much memory of the situation. Now, there's a lengthy post about this case at the Unsolved Mysteries subreddit, which was started shortly after the Netflix episode dropped, and it contains a number of comments there by a poster claiming to be Brandy, who goes under the username PetersonBrandy84. Obviously, I'll add the usual disclaimer that I can't say with 100% certainty that this poster is actually her, but from my research, most of the information she has shared has checked out, so I do believe she's genuine. And many of her comments do provide additional insight into her family's situation. I mentioned earlier that out of Sandy's 6 daughters, Lena appears to be the only one who was a biological child of her first husband, Robert Chapin. According to Brandy's Reddit comments, each of Sandy's children were conceived by a different man, and half of them don't even know who their biological father is. Since Sandy always wanted a boy, perhaps this explains why she continued to have so many different children until Lena finally had a boy on her behalf when she gave birth to Culture. Sandy was described as someone who liked to hook up with a number of different men, as she would eventually get bored with them and feel compelled to move on to the next one. It sounds like she also enjoyed the challenge of pursuing married men or men who had brothers, which would explain why she married Albert McCullough and then later decided to dump him for Gary, as she may have gotten a thrill over seeing 2 brothers fighting over her. So now let's start analyzing Gary's disappearance. Obviously, there doesn't appear to be much of a mystery in regards to what actually happened to him, since the events shared by Lena during her tape-recorded confession may be the complete truth. But I think the big unanswered question here involves motive. Yes, we know that Sandy had been conducting an affair with Kristopher Klemp and no longer wanted to stay married to Gary, but this was hardly the first time in her life that she cheated on her spouse and decided to dump him. Like I just said, she had previously done the exact same thing with Gary's brother, Albert. While Gary and Albert were both described as good, hard-working guys and caring stepfathers who were well liked by Sandy's daughters, it sounds like the same cannot be said about her first husband, Robert. According to Brandy's Reddit comments, Robert was physically abusive towards Sandy and did not hold down a job, so Sandy pretty much had to support the entire family on her own. So this begs the question of why Sandy would go through the standard process of divorcing Robert and Albert, but then decide to escalate things into murder in order to end her marriage to Gary. Well, we know that the couple was experiencing serious financial problems around the time Gary went missing, as Sandy had apparently not been making the house payments and the family was in danger of losing their farm. This would explain why Sandy was going to such lengths as passing bad checks with Gary's forged signature on them, and Sandy probably feared that if Gary ended things with her, she would be forced to leave their farm. But it's worth noting that Kristopher Klemp hailed from a well-off family who had a lot more money and property. So if Sandy had simply divorced Gary and left him for Chris, she probably still would have wound up in a situation where she had more financial security. It would be one thing if Gary's death was an unplanned crime of passion in which Sandy killed him in the heat of the moment, but that doesn't appear to be the case at all, as the scenario presented by Lena during her confession is that Sandy flat out shot Gary 3 times while he was sitting on the couch eating scrambled eggs. Granted, I do not believe that Lena or anyone else personally witnessed the murder, as it sounds like it took place while the kids were away at school, so Lena would have technically only been sharing what her mother told her. But there is ample evidence that Sandy had been planning to kill Gary prior to his disappearance, particularly the incident where she fired a shotgun at him, and the only reason he wasn't killed because the shell inside the barrel was a dud. And it's apparent that Chris knew what was going to happen, since he allegedly offered money to another man to kill Gary on his behalf. This definitely has all the signs of a premeditated crime, where Sandy felt that making Gary disappear would be a much better option than divorce. Indeed, one former co-worker of Sandy's claimed that she had overheard her speak about killing Gary, and when the co-worker told her to just divorce him, Sandy reportedly replied, quote, that she wasn't going to give him a dime. The story provided by Lena during her tape-recorded statement is that after she arrived home from school, the other kids were sent off to do chores, while Sandy brought her inside to view Gary's body in one of the bedrooms, and she was forced to assist with the disposal of the body and the cleanup. Since Gary was a 240-pound man, I'm sure it was difficult for Sandy to get rid of him on her own, which is why she enlisted Lena's help. Of course, given that Lena was only 13 years old at the time, this scenario is all sorts of messed up. But even though Brandy was technically the oldest of Sandy's 6 daughters, Lena was pretty much the leader among them, who had the most take-charge attitude and could control her siblings into doing whatever their mother wanted. Now, you might be wondering why Lena's tape-recorded confession did not immediately lead to Sandy being arrested and charged with murder, but the issue is that Lena refused to speak with the police. If she had been able to provide investigators with corroborating evidence to support her story, and also agreed to testify against her mother, the authorities might have felt they had a strong enough case to send Sandy to prison, even if they could not recover Gary's remains. You also have to remember that this recording was secretly made by Albert, a civilian who did not have any sort of warrant or court order, which is why this was considered to be hearsay evidence and could not be presented to the jury at Sandy's civil trial years later. Now, parts of Lena's story would later be corroborated by Brandy and Robin, who reported seeing incriminating things on the day of Gary's disappearance, such as Sandy scrubbing the floors with bleach, and her and Chris moving what appeared to be Gary's body. But both girls were too frightened to come forward for years, and really, when you hear Brandy's account of how Chris drove her out into a remote area and pointed a gun at her until Sandy talked him out of pulling the trigger, can you blame her? So obviously, it appears that Chris played a role in Gary's death, and while he may not have actually been present when Sandy committed the crime, he definitely helped with the cover-up. And the fact that Kris moved in with Sandy only 4 days after Gary originally went missing is a telltale sign that they both knew he was never coming back. I certainly don't want to sound like I'm being sympathetic towards someone who was complicit in a murder, but it is worth mentioning that Sandy was very manipulative towards Kris as well. During the early stages of their relationship, Sandy lied to Kris by telling him that she was pregnant with his child and that Gary was beating her. So Kris may have convinced himself that murder was justified because he was protecting an abused woman from her violent husband. According to Brandy, since Kris was a decade younger than Sandy, she was worried that Kris would want nothing to do with her if he found out she had 6 kids, so when he made his first visit to the farm, Sandy initially told Brandy to pretend she was a coworker of hers rather than one of her daughters. It sounds like whenever Sandy cheated on her spouse, she had a habit of manipulating her children into helping her cover up her extramarital affairs and lying on her behalf. As you recall, in the months following Gary's disappearance, Kris was actually charged with conspiracy to commit murder, as he had allegedly made a number of incriminating statements about killing Gary and even offered money to another man, Stephen Turner, to commit the murder for him. Obviously, since this was all hearsay and there was no hard evidence of foul play at that point, the charges had to be dropped, but it would have been interesting to see how things might have played out if Turner had accepted Kris's offer. Perhaps the murder-for-hire plot would have been bungled so badly that the case would have been solved a long time ago. Kris has never gone on the record and done any interviews to publicly address these allegations, and I would also be curious to hear from his ex-wife Jennifer, who had originally been a defendant in the wrongful death lawsuit. It sounds like Jennifer dropped Kris off at Gary's farm on the night he went missing and picked Kris up again during the early morning hours. Since Jennifer described Kris as looking very scared, he had likely just gone through the act of helping Sandy dispose of Gary's body, but I don't get the sense that Jennifer directly witnessed any criminal activity, because otherwise, that might have been strong enough evidence to make an arrest. Considering that her husband cheated on her and left her for another woman, I have my doubts that Jennifer would have had much motivation to cover for Kris. Considering Sandy's history of ending her relationships with men after only a few years, it is somewhat surprising that she and Kris managed to stay married from 2000 until 2014. But then again, it is a bit surprising that they agreed to divorce in the first place, as if they were still married, spousal privilege could protect Sandy and Kris from being forced to testify against the other. According to Brandy's Reddit comments, Kris has apparently been offered immunity in order to testify against Sandy, but he has always turned them down. He may feel that there's no chance that investigators are going to find Gary's remains or amass enough evidence to charge him with murder, so why not keep maintaining your innocence rather than publicly admit your own involvement in a crime? While Kris has technically been found liable of Gary's death in a court of law, the burden of proof in a civil trial is much lower than a criminal trial, and, well, since Kris and Sandy never even bothered to show up in court to defend themselves, the jury's decision must have been an easy one. The couple have not paid 1 penny of the $7 million judgment which was awarded to Gary's daughters, as they apparently put everything they owned under the name of Kris's father to prevent this from happening. But you have to wonder if this verdict might have played a role in their decision to divorce just over 1 year later. And given all the negative publicity surrounding Sandy and her potential involvement in 2 murders, it is surprising that she managed to get married to another man after divorcing Kris, but she is known for being a master manipulator. Now, while it seems obvious that Kris played a role in covering up Gary's murder, it's unclear what role, if any, he might have played in Lena's disappearance. Since he was still married to Sandy at that time, I'm sure he probably knows she did something to Lena, but did he have any first-hand knowledge or involvement that could lead to an arrest or the recovery of Lena's remains? The advantage of figuring out what happened to Gary is that we have a witness who recorded a first-hand account of the situation, so it's easy to figure out how Gary was killed and his body was disposed of. But we don't have that in Lena's case, and since there was such a lengthy delay before launching a proper missing persons investigation, the exact circumstances of how her probable murder played out are still unclear. Since Lena made a confession about Gary's murder to Albert, and this led to the involvement of the police, you can understand why Sandy may have felt compelled to go through the heinous act of killing her own daughter in order to eliminate a witness who could implicate her in a murder. However, Lena's disappearance did not actually take place until nearly 3 years after her confession, and the investigation had died down by that point, so what would compel Sandy to get rid of her in February of 2006? The timing of Lena's confession is interesting, as it took place in June of 2003, and she gave birth to Coulter in November of that year, meaning that she would have been pregnant at the time she made her admission, so perhaps the prospect of having a child is what compelled Lena to finally come clean. After all, everyone who knew Lena said that her personality seemed to change after Gary went missing, as she started hanging out with a bad crowd and became more self-destructive, possibly due to the overwhelming guilt over the whole situation. It seems like having Coulter is what finally prompted Lena to turn her life around, but I think the big issue is that it was causing her to become more independent from Sandy. Lena was planning to get married and move away and start a new family, which on its own would be enough to cause issues with such a controlling, narcissistic mother, particularly since Sandy seemed determined to practically raise Coulter as her own son. But since Lena had first-hand knowledge about a murder that her mother committed, and Sandy would no longer be able to keep an eye on her at all times, I'm sure she was paranoid that Lena would one day feel the need to clear her conscience and share everything she knew with the authorities. Given that Lena was a minor at the time Gary's murder took place, there would have been no hesitation to offer her immunity to testify, so I can see how things could have escalated to the point where Sandy decided to get Lena out of the picture. So it sounds like the last confirmed sighting of Lena took place on Valentine's Day, as her fiancé, Jason Bryant, said that Lena was at their apartment when he left to go to work that morning, but when he returned home later that day, Lena was gone, and Sandy was already moving out her belongings. This is where Sandy shared the story that Lena ran off to Florida with another man, and while you might be wondering why Jason didn't become more suspicious of the whole situation, it's unclear to me if Lena ever told him the story about what happened to Gary, so Jason may not have had any reason to believe that Lena was harmed by her own mother. Jason also did not seem to have much resistance to Sandy taking custody of Coulter, but he was not actually the boy's biological father. There isn't much information out there about Coulter's father, other than the fact that he lived in Arkansas, and while Lena did apparently take her son to see him on at least one occasion, I don't get the impression that he played much of a role in Coulter's life. Now, in August of 2016, the Cassville Democrat published an article about this case, which shared rumors that Chris had done inappropriate things with Lena while they were living together, and, well, he may have actually been the child's biological father. That's pretty horrifying to think about, as Lena was still a minor when she became pregnant, but the whole situation is extra messed up when you consider that Sandy really wanted to raise Coulter as her own son, and her own husband may have been the boy's birth father. Of course, this whole situation may be nothing more than rumors and speculation, so I'm not going to say with 100% certainty that Chris impregnated Lena, but it just makes the sad story all the more creepy. Now, in a 10-year anniversary article which was published in the Salem News in February of 2016, the owner of Lena's apartment building claimed that after Jason moved out, and she went in there to clean the unit, she noticed that a window was broken, and there was a large, dark-colored stain on the carpet, which she was unable to shampoo out. Since the owner did not have any reason to suspect foul play had taken place at that time, she claimed that she threw the carpet away before it could be analyzed as evidence. Sometime later, the entire apartment was destroyed when a renter who was smoking in bed accidentally started a fire, so the unit was never processed as a potential crime scene. Well, when the owner shared this story with the Salem News, the Dent County Sheriff's Office responded by saying that she had never mentioned anything about the stained carpet when they first interviewed her, so the whole situation has been a source of controversy. However, in one of her Reddit comments, Brandy claims that the stain in the carpet had actually been caused by Lena suffering a miscarriage in the apartment the year before she went missing, so if this is true, the carpet likely has no relevance to this case. I have no idea if Lena was actually murdered inside her apartment, but regardless, it's clear that something happened to her on February the 14th, 2006. Of course, the biggest obstacle against putting the pieces of the puzzle together is that Lena was not officially reported missing for over 2.5 years, and it would be an additional 3.5 years before anyone started performing a proper investigation. I think the confusion stems from the fact that Lena's father reported her missing to the Barry County Sheriff's Office, who were from the area where Lena used to live, but at that point, her family was living in Dent County, and the apartment where Lena had lived was technically located in Crawford County. Barry County said that they tried to convince Dent County to file a missing and endangered report on Lena in 2008, but they refused to do so at that time. It sounds like Dent County finally decided to open a new investigation in 2012 after interviewing Jason and learning the suspicious circumstances of how Lena abruptly disappeared from their apartment. But who knows how much potential evidence was lost or destroyed during the 6-year window. We know that Brandy and Robin would eventually speak out against their mother and accuse her of being responsible for Lena's disappearance, but other than being told that she ran away to Florida, it does not sound like they have any first-hand knowledge of what happened to their sister. Unlike with Gary's case, I have no idea if Sandy might have enlisted anyone's help to dispose of Lena's remains or cover up the crime. Since Lena's other 3 sisters have never spoken publicly about the situation, I'm not sure if they saw or heard anything suspicious. While there's ample evidence that Gary's murder was premeditated, we really can't be certain that the same thing happened with Lena because, for all we know, this could have been a crime of passion in which Sandy didn't initially plan on killing her, but things escalated into violence. There is so little evidence in this case that if Sandy had been moving Lena's belongings out of her apartment on the same day she disappeared and shared an obviously false story about Lena running off to Florida with another man, I might be more willing to acknowledge the possibility that Lena was harmed by an unknown third party. But Sandy's own suspicious actions and her immediate desire to file abandonment charges against Lena in order to seek custody of Coulter indicates that she has to be responsible for what happened. One of the big unanswered questions is what actually happened to Lena's remains, and an even bigger question is if they are recoverable. The story provided in Lena's confession is that Gary's body was burned so badly that it became nothing more than ashes, though even the hottest fire cannot completely destroy a human body. But Lena claimed that her mother dumped buckets filled with Gary's remains out the truck window as they were driving through the countryside and scattered them all over the place. So while I'm sure that some of Gary's bone fragments are out there in rural Missouri somewhere, attempting to find and recover them sounds like it would be a very daunting challenge. If this is what happened to Gary, then I fear that Sandy may have done the same thing to Lena, making her remains difficult to recover as well. But I know Lena's sisters think that her remains might be buried somewhere on one of Sandy's former properties in Sligo or Salem. Another big concern in this case is the fate of Coulter, who will be turning 20 years old shortly after the release of this episode. If you're wondering why Sandy would even be allowed to raise him after being found liable of murder at the civil trial, that's because she was able to obtain legal custody of the boy before the trial took place. It was reported that Sandy homeschooled Coulter and kept him very sheltered to prevent him from learning about what happened to his mother, but given that he's now a legal adult and his family's story has gotten widespread exposure on Netflix, you have to think he would have heard all the stories by now. At the time the Unsolved Mysteries episode dropped in 2020, Coulter was apparently still living with Sandy, and Brandy and Robin said they had not seen him in several years. But Brandy has since commented on Reddit that Coulter finally decided to break away from his grandmother and now wants nothing to do with Sandy and is living with one of Lena's sisters and has the full love and support of his aunts. I really do hope that's true and that Coulter is living the best life possible, but things will never truly be right with him, his aunts, or the McCullough family unless they receive full justice for what happened to Lena and Gary. Without a body or any hard evidence of foul play, it's often really hard to build a strong enough case for an arrest, but it's definitely not impossible. In fact, within the past several years, we've seen a number of murder cases go to trial which have ended in a conviction, even without the victim's remains being found. While I definitely believe that Sandy was the mastermind behind both these murders, I'm sure that Kristopher Klemp was also involved or has full knowledge about what happened. There are probably other people out there besides him who have important information, so in order for an arrest to take place, we might need them to come forward. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Gary McCullough, please contact the Barry County Sheriff's Office at 417-847-3121. That's 417-847-3121. And if you have any information on the disappearance of Lena Chapin, please contact the Dent County Sheriff's Office at 573-729-3241. That's 573-729-3241. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 5 years, our Patreon page has released dozens of exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives. This past month, I released an episode titled The Lost Heirs of Unsolved Mysteries, which explores a couple of cases from the show about mysterious individuals who left a substantial amount of money behind when they passed away, and the authorities were attempting to track down any rightful heirs who were entitled to inherit the decedent's estate. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss the unexplained 1995 death of Devin Williams. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 50 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Athena B, Kyle P, and Jackie P. Thank you so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Anyways, I'm sure you know, I'll be attending CrimeCon next week, and per tradition, whenever I attend one of these podcasting events, I like to release an episode about a case from the event's host city that very same week. So that means I'll soon be releasing an episode about an unsolved mystery from Orlando, Florida. So until then, have yourself a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.